Welcome to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. Each week, Matt, Curt, Jerry, and the occasional special guest explore how the trauma-informed paradigm challenges traditional beliefs and approaches concerning a wide variety of areas. This podcast addresses psychological trauma in an educational manner and is not designed to replace mental health treatment. If anything in this podcast makes you feel uncomfortable or anxious, please talk to a mental health professional.
Welcome, friends, to episode 28 of the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. I'm here with my good friends, Jerry and Curt, and we have one of my friends from Southern California and an expert on mindfulness, Melissa Springstead's joining us as well, which I'm really excited for Melissa to join us. Melissa and I met when I was doing a series of trainings in Pasadena, and I believe we were introduced ahead of time about you and some of your colleagues doing some work around mindfulness. And I basically, if you're having me talk to about a full day on any subject, mindfulness comes up. And so I integrated you, I know, into the self-care one, the trauma-informed care one, the trauma treatment one. And then I had the pleasure of working with you as well with Pasadena Unified School Districts in August. So we're longtime co-presenters at this point, and it's so excited we could get you on the podcast today to talk about trauma and mindfulness. So I want to welcome Melissa formally, and also give her, as Melissa, as you know, we start out every week with bright, shiny objects, things that we're thinking about, reading about, for the three of us, or at least me, obsessing about. And so I just kind of want to give you a chance a little bit more to introduce yourself formally to our audience and just kind of tell us about something you're thinking about and maybe even writing about right now as well.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm excited to be on and talk to you guys or talk with you guys about all of this. I've had a lot of fun with the trainings that we've done with Young and Healthy and Pasadena Unified, and excited to talk a bit more and learn from all of you. So my background, I started out in education before going into the field of psychology. I was a teacher's assistant in a school setting and really found that I wanted to give more one-on-one attention to the kid that might be sitting in the back of the room, or parents going through a divorce, or something going on with them. So went back, got my master's in marriage and family therapy, and started working in an inner city charter school system where we had a training program with graduate students so that we were able to provide a training for new therapists as well as support for the students in the school setting and the families. So saw, a lot of trauma, little t, big T, all types of trauma in the schools. Was there for a number of years, and then got this idea that I wanted to learn more. So I went on to get my doctorate in marriage and family therapy, but the doctorate in marriage and family therapy is it's what the degree is, but my research was looking at executive functioning, specifically ADHD, and looking at it from a mindfulness perspective of treatment. So with that, I loved the doctoral program. Even the dissertation writing process was enjoyable because I was developing a program that really looked at treating adolescents with executive functioning deficits. So, as time has gone on, I'm now able to look at that also from the trauma lens. And the more that I've learned from you, Matt, I'm really able to see that blend that it's, yes, ADHD was the diagnosis that I was focusing on, and it is a diagnosis that I work a lot with. But we can throw the diagnosis away and we can look really more at the person and what they've experienced and what else might be going on for them. My shiny object right now is that I am currently working on a book it's a workbook that is this program, and the acronym is Anchored. I have a counseling office here in Pasadena called Anchor Children and Family Services. And we, like the symbol of an anchor means a lot. Mindfulness means a lot to me as a previous sailor. I used to race sailboats, so there's that symbol that means a lot to me. But looking at the acronym Anchored, each one of those letters represents an aspect of executive functioning that we're treating and an aspect of mindfulness exercise. So deadline for my draft is May 1st. I'm deep in it right now, and taking a break to talk to you guys.
Well,
Ahoy to
yes,
you.
we appreciate that. And as somebody who's gone through that process, you've got some cheerleaders here. I can't wait to see it too. So I'm really excited, and we'll let our audience know too when and where it's available once published. So I'm
Thanks
sure
so
after
much.
this, a lot will be interested in that work. So. Awesome. So I'm going to go with my bright, shiny object because it's about birthdays. One, and we're recording this on the 23rd of March, and it's Jerry's birthday today. So I was going to sing for you, Jerry, but I'm not going to put the audience through that.
My sound went off.
So I won't put you through it, but I do want to wish you a happy birthday, Jerry. And there's another birthday that's been my bright, shiny object this week as well. And that's the birthday of the Affordable Care Act. I think it's 8 years in. And I just got back late last night. So if I'm a little tired today or my voice cracks, forgive me, from doing 2 days of training with some public health workers in Louisiana. And I'm fortunate enough to travel to different areas of the country and really see the distinction between states that expanded Medicaid and those that haven't. And, the difference in the reality of people living in poverty in those two states. And Louisiana has been a great one, along with Arkansas and Kentucky in the South, because I went to Louisiana before they expanded. They were one of the late expansion because Bobby Jindal was Bobby Jindal. And then they expanded Medicaid. And it's just so cool in these states that they can kind of keep track of patients that they got insurance for the first time, sometimes in their adult life, got into a medical appointment, found out they had a disease while it was still treatable, and got the care that they needed to really save their lives. That if they would have waited a few more weeks to where it was bad enough to go into an emergency room for treatment, may not have made it, and it could have been terminal. So just really, as somebody who does a lot of work in homelessness and poverty and all this stuff, lives saved around the country. And I think it's a chance for us all to celebrate the advocacy work, to say that healthcare is a human right, and that we really need to continue that advocacy work in this time and place. Well, that's trying to, in some ways, be taken away or scaled back. So happy birthday to Jerry. Happy birthday to the Affordable Care Act. And again, I will not sing to either. So Curt, what's your bright, shiny object of the week, my friend?
Are you 29, Jerry?
29 and a half.
One more time. I've been immersed in writing a grant proposal about autism services. So I've been kind of really focused in on autism for a little while. And I think my bright, shiny object out of being immersed in that is the word neurodiversity. I think how cool it is to think about switching the way we talk about a diagnosable condition as something that is diversity, not, again, what's wrong with you, right? It's a different way of looking at it. And I think I've been impressed by that the last several weeks, and in talking to a lot of people about it, and that we're using that word, I think is just really cool. So that's my bright, shiny object for the week.
Awesome. And one of the books that I really loved out there was Neurotribes. I thought that was a really cool way to look at, again, as a diversity and as a skill set that's actually really in high demand right now in many ways. And it's really, like you said, cool to see that as a strength in our culture and not something of a weakness in individuals. And I think that's a great way to look at it. So awesome. Jerry, what about you, my friend? What are you thinking about on your birthday?
Well, the first thing I was thinking about is neurocentricity, in that we're getting very, very focused on this brain and not to realize we know so little about the brain, right? We know a lot more than we know, but we know so little about it. And so I think that as we kind of get really focused on the stuff that we know, is to realize it's such a small part of the whole. And that's the exciting part of all of this, is there's unbelievable amounts to learn. and be open and curious about some of this stuff. But I think my bright, shiny object this week is springtime. Going out and seeing the deer in my backyard and watching people yesterday walk around with shorts and short sleeve shirts and kind of rejuvenated. Actually, people smiling and laughing. Spring has a way of kind of waking people up. So I want to kind of just stop for a second and recognize we got through another winter and spring is here. So that's my bright, shiny object.
And I would personally like to apologize to all our East Coast viewers who are buried under 2 feet of snow as we talk about the 75-degree weather we're having out here in Denver. We're sending it your way. So,
but you know, springtime in the Rockies, we get our share of snow.
Oh, we will. And I just, my thoughts right now are the folks in Southern California that are getting some weather of your own as well. And I know that there's some worries out there that I've been paying attention to. So with spring as we get these really shifts, but again, it's nice to be out in shorts and a t-shirt feeling good. So yep, absolutely. All right, well, let's jump into the subject. And Melissa, I'm going to start with you on this question and then kind of throw it around to everybody else for their opinion. But especially for our listeners who may not be, I'm sure most folks have heard of the term mindfulness, but it's a word that's getting thrown around in a lot of different ways right now. And so I just would love to get your answer to this, the maybe complex question, but at least simple in nature is, I just kind of I wonder what mindfulness means for you. Well, what's your definition that you're working on, especially as I know writing about something makes you get really concrete about it in a different way.
Yeah, so I'm going to try to take a step back from the really detailed part and look at it from some of the ways that I explain it with some of the adolescents that I work with.
Great.
I use the example of we go through life on autopilot. We go through, like you were using an example in the last podcast about brushing your teeth. You don't think about it, you just do it. And we can work on that in that if we are a little bit more mindful, we know what we're doing. We're connecting our head to our body so that our head, I use the example of it's kind of floating around thinking about other things, but our body's going through a certain motion. You know, it's walking down the street. It is sitting in a desk at school, it's driving a car, but our head is a week later or a week in the past. It's not in that moment. So if we think about that idea of being on autopilot and not necessarily the opposite of it, but shifting that a little bit and looking at, okay, if we're not on autopilot, we are a little bit more mindful. We're a little bit more aware of and connected, you know, head and body are more connected. Our mind and our body are more connected in what it is that we're doing. It's focusing, so, you know, with that, you're focusing on the present moment, you know, what it is that you're doing in that moment. And one of the things that I always like to make sure people look at is without judgment, you know, whatever the experiences that you're going through, that you try to remove any judgment from it. A thought's a thought, a feeling's a feeling, an experience is an experience, things are temporary. So let's look at it objectively. You know, if we're having a thought about something that, you know, I'm going to fail this next test, that's just a thought. Let's not grab it. Let's let it go. Let's sit where we are. If we're not in that test yet, where are we? Are we driving to school? Are we walking to the classroom? Let's feel our feet walking to the classroom and, you know, kind of connect back to what it is that our whole body is doing, not just where our mind is. So that, you know, I mean, obviously we can get into a lot more detail around what mindfulness is, but in kind of a not simple way, because it isn't a simple practice, but I don't know, maybe a little bit of a simple way of looking at it is that kind of looking at not being on autopilot and being more connected to our experiences and connecting our head to our body so that we're one.
I love that. And I think, you know, we can, mindfulness is tricky for some people because they immediately jump to Zen meditation or, you know, all these other practices where they have to, you know, I have to sit in silence with a clear head for 30 minutes a day. And I think what we're really finding with as mindfulness really integrates into our consciousness is it really it is being in our body in a way and being present where we're at. Jerry, I'm interested to I know we've talked about this concept and thrown it out there a lot, but just kind of You know, when you hear the word mindfulness and sort of what it means to you, I would love to hear any thoughts you'd like to add to that.
Well, my first association was integration, right? Is becoming more integrated, to be aware of sensations, emotions, and thoughts, and kind of observing the process. But what I find is, why do we have to work at this, right? We have this cortical functioning to do it. We don't really work at breathing. We don't work at, why is it so much work to become mindful, right? So it's kind of like this part of our brain that's so young and undeveloped, we have to actually consciously connect it. Or else it can kind of go off on its own and do its own thing to kind of look at that. So my thought about it is it seems like it's a lot of work sometimes to express that part of our biology that's uniquely human.
That is a great statement. That is a great statement. I hadn't thought about it as that, but it is hard work. Like I'm trying to get to the Zen level where I can kind of clear it all out. I'm more of an active guy where I'm counting or doing something, but man, the things that pop into your brain when you're trying to clear your head is weird. And you can, the audience.
Your brain, especially.
Yeah, exactly. The audience can go wherever they want with that. There's no details.
Some brains are more primed for that than others.
Exactly. I'm stopping with that, and because we have something more interesting, I'd love to get Curt's. Kurt, what's especially in the behavioral world and your work. I'm really interested to see your thoughts about mindfulness and maybe some practical applications that you see in your work.
I got two stories about it. And the first one goes with, I remember distinctly thinking this as I learned about mindfulness. Jerry probably remembers me saying this to him at one point. And I said, it's amazing how much when we're treating children, we put so much effort into getting them to think in the future. And because they live in the moment all the time, right? And we learn it so well that when we're adults, we have to learn to be in the moment instead of living in the future all the time. And so I find that kind of ironic as we talk about mindfulness and Jerry's point about, why is that so hard? Like, well, we learned it really well.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Right, we have to unlearn what we were taught, throughout the course of our entire childhood and learn to do something different. So that's kind of my first story. And then my second story was years ago, I went through a 2-day training on dialectical behavior therapy with a really wonderful trainer. If anybody ever gets a chance, Tony DeBose is one of the best trainers I've ever been around. And as we walked out of day one, a psychologist that I was working with kind of came up next to me and he said, "Boy, I bet you hated that mindfulness part. Like, that's not behavioral at all." And I said, "Actually, I think totally the opposite. I think it's entirely behavioral. It's just that it happens inside of our head. Right? But if we learn it, just like you learn anything else, it becomes a voluntary thing that we have to learn how to do." So those are kind of my two stories and my thoughts about mindfulness is even going back to last week's conversation about what do we talk about as voluntary. In the behavioral language, we call that operant. It is sensitive to changes in the environment. And Melissa, as you're talking, and love to get your take on this perspective, right? As you're teaching somebody mindfulness, you're providing to them feedback about when they did it right and when they didn't do it right. And that's very behavioral. As we go through the process of teaching, it's dependent on input and interaction with the environment. And sometimes we have to get like confirmation from another person that we did a skill correctly. And so as we teach that and we describe how to do it, and you go try it and let me know how that went, and they report to you how it went, and you say, "Yeah, that was great." Right? They feel good about that, and they're like, "Okay, I did it right." And that becomes the teaching process that in my world of behavior analysis is very behavioral.
So Melissa, I'm going to throw that question to you. And if you use the word operant at all, you will get bonus points.
So you get 3 points for using operant.
Let's see. I appreciate the way you're talking about that. I think when I am teaching it to the children or adolescents or teachers or parents that I'm working with, there is no right or wrong. So I think that the actual practice of it, there is no right or wrong, because we really want to remove that judgment. So if I'm using a language around, this was not done right, then I'm, in a passive way, I am judging. So what I can agree with you on is the act of how to create those habits. So, when I was using the example before we got on talking about, brushing your teeth in the morning, that is the behavior around that, and the way that I help to integrate, to make sure they are breathing before going to bed, is we're creating, either a Post-it on their mirror. So when they are brushing their teeth, there's that behavioral reminder to do that, or an alert on their phone. With all of the technology now, sometimes we're incorporating it in a positive way. They can send a reminder, at 9 o'clock to do some deep breathing before going to bed. So there's that behavioral component that on the outside, we do need to have some practice around how to integrate it, how to have it become more of I'm not having to work so hard, Jerry, kind of like what you were saying, that we do have to work so hard on it. We can get to that point where it is more just a behavior that you're doing. Like, using the example of brushing teeth, when I was first starting to learn how to practice mindfulness, I was having to set reminders, or on an Apple phone, you can set location. So when you pull up to a certain location, it beeps and, okay, stop, breathe. Okay, now let's go. But now when I brush my teeth, I'm connected to brushing my teeth. Or if I'm walking into work, I'm really trying to, when I'm walking into work, ground myself as I'm walking into work. So I think there is the behavioral component of how do we integrate and incorporate these practices to make them more habitual. But then once they're there, it might not be as much. Do I earn any bonus points?
You didn't say operant.
You didn't say operant.
Well, it's true. I have to.
You got to throw operant in there.
You gotta have a clicker. You gotta have a clicker.
Not using a sentence. Yes, I did last week, so I gotta do it too. So, Melissa, I wonder, because one of the things that in my thinking, and again, is I was writing along this subject and how we can help people sort of regulate and relate, again, to get to that prefrontal cortex and help them to cognitively engage in academics or whatever tasks that they're working on. One of the things that I've been thinking a lot about, I don't know if I've got great answers for it yet, but, mindfulness, in some ways seems like the coping skills I used to teach folks, like take that deep breath. For kids that I worked with that were gang members, so many of them, their initial reaction to stress was to step forward and kind of attack somebody, that fight response. I wanted them to step back when they were able to feel that. And so, there's this, and I think this opens up so many different ways of bringing the mindfulness research into really practical moments. So I'm interested, as you work with your expertise in ADHD, and we know the similarities between ADHD and trauma. We're all familiar about that's often misdiagnosed, but even when correctly diagnosed, there's the attention issues and a whole lot of similarities. So when you're working with a kid that has that difficulty with attention or hyperactivity, what are some of the, how do you start to approach helping them practice mindfulness in a way that translates to changes in behavior, at least presence in the classroom and in other parts of their life?
So you're kind of asking, like, how do I get the buy-in to actually, like, the why would we do any of this?
The buy-in, but also more so how do you, okay, let's say somebody has the buy-in. How do you start working with them to get really practical applications of this where they may be struggling in other parts of their life?
So often I look at where the biggest symptoms are, just to start, so we can dive in a little bit in a more specific way, be able to have some symptom reduction. So, like, let's say there's a kid that is, getting really anxious before taking a test. then the way that I might tangibly start with that is teaching a breathing strategy that they do right before taking a test, and have them rate prior to doing the breathing strategy and after in my office how they're feeling, you know, how they're feeling on a scale of 0 to 10 before doing it and how they're feeling on a 0 to 10 afterwards, but really helping them to learn what's going on in their body. When you ask the question, how are you feeling right now, that they're not just going to the thinking feeling, they're not just going to the emotion feeling, they're going to the physical feeling. So, you know, they're noticing they have butterflies in their stomach. A lot of kids don't have this language. They don't know how to verbalize, you know, my heart is racing, or my hands are shaking, or I'm short of breath, or I feel like I'm going to throw up. You know, there's a lot of kids that don't have that language. So helping to connect and give them language to that helps, because it also normalizes some of it for them. But then they can start to connect. So if I'm going to have you do a 4-7-8 breath, for example, then I want you to be able to feel it in the office and see that there's a difference there. You know, a difference from how you might be feeling when we're talking about a test, you're thinking about a test, you're imagining you're sitting in the test, and then you do that breath work, and then connect it back to what's going on in their body, you know, talking about the nervous system, talking about the limbic system, talking about, you know, what is happening and how physiologically there's some changes that are happening. It's not just a feel good, so to speak.
Yeah.
So, you know, that, and then following up on it, you know, making sure, like, if I know a kid has a test, I'll often send them a text and say, how, you know, during final exams, how was it?
Mm-hmm.
Or send a reminder with a test taking meditation the night before, you know, don't forget to do meditation. It is hard because, you know, a lot of these kids that do have difficulty with attention, whether it's trauma, it's ADHD, it's teenager, it's, you know, whatever it might be, it's hard to remember to do these things. So I think that having that follow-up, and then that's also where I think teachers and parents can come in as well, of them being able to help integrate and remind of some of the strategies.
Excellent. And I think you really brought out there, and the labeling piece, I've really been paying a lot of attention to when we look at from a trauma perspective, oftentimes folks with that complex trauma history have, you know, trouble with expressive and receptive language. And if I can't, you know, I've shared this quite a few times, but with the nonverbal kids I worked with in a special education setting, they just really taught me that if I can't tell you I'm pissed off at you, that's going to come out behaviorally. And sometimes with the kids I work with, not a safe behavior, but it really gave me empathy for all the really kids and adults I've worked with, knowing that even folks that might have a higher verbal ability to identify what's going on inside yourself at any given moment is an incredibly complex thing for anybody, much less folks with specific damage to some of those areas in the brain too. And so I think that's a lot of powerful stuff you gave us there. Jerry, I'd love to get your thought as somebody who's sort of watched the field of trauma-specific treatment, or whatever we sort of want to call it, with the EMDRs, the trauma-informed CBTs. I would throw DBT in there, what Curt was talking about earlier. Mindfulness seems to be a part of all of these, that at least that I've sort of studied throughout. I just kind of wondered, why do you think in the trauma field, mindfulness has played such a critical role as we've developed these best practice treatments over time?
Well, when we think about trauma, you think about the loss of control of your ability to place your attention and your regulate your physiology at will. It's very stimulus bound, right? So whether that stimulus for Curt is in the environment or it's internally, what is really you're at the effect of these things that activate you. And one of the things about our nervous system is when we get activated at different levels in random ways, it tends to sensitize our nervous system as opposed to creating a tolerance for things. So in trauma, the nervous system becomes more sensitized to become more reactive. And I think in mindfulness, we're actually beginning to help the nervous system develop some tolerance for experience, so that you can talk about it from an operant. I get a point.
Good
From
job.
an operant perspective, or I've heard people who are talking about hypnosis talk about this is really putting oneself in a self-trance. So different approaches have labeled these things in different ways, but the ability to put your attention intentionally where you want it to be is something that gets lost in trauma. So I think it's really important to kind of look at how this has arisen in all of the evidence-based kind of approaches, and it gets labeled different. But it really is about regaining a sense of control. It's really about having your kind of reaction be within your window of tolerance so that you can learn how to manage it, widening that window of tolerance. So, I think when we look at Stephen Porges's work and kind of managing that, is you're increasing that parasympathetic, heart rate variability in this model to kind of look at that. So there's a lot of physiological reasons why mindfulness would increase that, and why trauma would in some ways decrease our ability to kind of carry out some of these skills that Melissa's teaching her children.
Excellent. And Curt, I mean, Jerry said operant and polyvagal, so I got to go to you after that. Boy, you're getting bonus points on your birthday,
I just
Jerry.
threw that in. I had nothing to do with anything.
You were already going to get a star, but now you got 2 going, if not 3.
I was conditioned.
By many years of sitting and arguing with me.
Yes.
I get a point for having conditioned Jerry.
Which is pretty remarkable. As anybody that knows Jerry could tell you, maybe his wife would like to have
I was going to say, I'm sure
conversation
his
with
wife
you.
would say he is unconditionable.
Yes. but Curt, how when you think about, because I know you do you think a lot and help people with the behavioral intervention piece is a big part of your work as a supervisor and as somebody who looks at behavior. So I just kind of wondered, what role do you see with mindfulness coming in, and how's it sort of informed your work when you were trying to help somebody behaviorally be successful in an environment?
Yeah. I mean, one thing I think of a lot when I in this conversation, and of course thinking about interventions like mindfulness, is that we can train ourselves and learn over time how to shift our attention intentionally, and that we can focus in on things. As Jerry was talking, I was kind of thinking about this, and one of the keys here, I think, is that we can tend to feel really out of control when we aren't able to shift our attention to things that actually we do have some influence over and some control over. And so being able to shift attention and learn how to do that by repeated practice is really powerful. And I think that's one of the bedrocks of mindfulness, is to kind of be able to do that. And I like, Melissa, kind of something that you said, I think it is so important about mindfulness, is that idea of a judgment-free zone, essentially, right? That instead of attaching a label to a thought that we have as being good or bad or of value or not of value, to actually practice and learn how to just let that happen. And that is something that we have to practice doing. As we talked about earlier, we have to kind of unlearn our previous history of being taught to focus on, you better think about the future or that's not going to go well for you later, right? So keep thinking about that. And we've learned it so well as adults that we have a real hard time just having a judgment-free zone, kind of a value-free zone. So those are some of my thoughts about it. And I certainly have seen that be really valuable to people. To be able to do that, it really can help so much with managing the constant level of negative affect that gets elevated and is a part of trauma that can shift our attention really, really easily. I mean, one thing we've kind of talked about is that the brain is primed to do certain things, and focusing in on things that are dangerous and that generate affect that is unpleasant really focuses in our attention real quick. And it's easy for our brains to stay in that kind of habitual state of always focusing in on what we find annoying or what we find fearful or what we find uncertain. And to be able to shift attention to other things is quite critical.
So would you call that a volitional shift of intention? I think you would.
I would call it volitional, in your words.
Wow, this is going to become an inside joke that nobody is ever going to get. If nobody watches that free will episode, there
that's going to be a keystone episode, right?
Exactly, our Matt Nerd episode. This is becoming keystone. You know, and Melissa, I'd love to get your thoughts too. As on our podcast, we talk a lot about the brain as well. And one of the things that I've been fascinated with, again, especially from the trauma focus, but again, working with a lot of kids with that attentional deficit, the research coming out on mindfulness in the brain. And I wonder, I know we all probably have a little bit of thoughts on that, but just kind of for our audience, from the neurobiological perspective, what's mindfulness? How does that interact with what we know about the brain and brain functioning in your experience?
Well, it's a good question. I think right now my brain is going in lots of different directions with all of the work that I've been doing, and I'm going to try to separate some of what I've been currently writing and kind of look at it from a little bit of a different lens. So feel free to pop in if I'm off a little bit. I like how, Jerry, in the beginning, how you were talking about integrating. And I think that when we look at the parts of the brain, we look at the emotional parts, we look at the logical parts, we look at the overactivation, the underactivation. I like to look at mindfulness as a way of balancing a lot of that out and helping to integrate and bring that balancing in. And so like Dan Siegel and Tina Bryson, a lot of their work, how they talk about, like the flipping of the lid. And when you are in a trauma place or little t trauma, big T trauma, any sort of a negative emotion going on, and when you flip, you aren't able to access the front, the thinking upper level parts of your brain. With using mindfulness, if we kind of slow down that process and think about pausing when we start to get that activation, and talk to this part, talk to the emotional part, we're able to then access more of the thinking, and then that integrating can start to happen. And, working with kids and in that kind of that simple-ish language, without getting into too much of a lot of the kids, their eyes will glaze over when I'm talking about too much in the brain, that, that idea has been so helpful that they created and have brought in. So does that help kind of answer?
Absolutely. Well, I think the thing that really
good answer, Melissa.
Yes.
What's that?
I said that was a good answer.
Thank you.
well, I think absolutely. And part of this was like looking at, and I'd love to get everybody else's opinion and make sure I'm not over jumping in my conclusion, but it seems like if we can help people practice mindfulness in a safe way, because again, I always like to put, when we're talking about trauma and mindfulness, to be careful with that and really, like I say, start people off with small doses, because so often if we ask people to clear their mind, what I hear is the demons come out. I've had a lot of people tell me, or past trauma memories pop into consciousness.
And is it okay if I jump in just
absolutely
quickly?
Please do.
We often don't want to clear our mind, like the idea of being mindful is not, and this is something that, when you think about, if I mention meditation, for example, to a kid, they're like, oh, I can't clear my mind. It's like, well, we don't need to clear our mind. We need to be curious and witness it. We need to witness what is it that's going through our mind, and then going into that non-judgment piece and just letting it be there and letting it go. Like I use the example of either sitting on the beach where there's planes that go with the banners behind them. That banner's your thought, your feeling, your behavior, whatever the experience is, and it's just going to keep going if you let it. or you can try to hang on the back. And when you're hanging on the back of that airplane's banner, it's not going to be too fun. So, you know, that kind of an idea that we don't want to clear, we want to just observe.
Yeah,
Clear might not be possible.
Yeah.
Actually,
Jerry
totally
would love
clear
to
might
hang
not
on the
be
back of that plane.
Uh-oh.
That's Jerry though. But yeah, and absolutely. And what I get excited about, what I've seen in the research is that when we're focused, we're there. You can see this in brain scans. There's more activation in the prefrontal cortex, which we're getting more energy, more information, as Daniel Siegel says, into the areas damaged a lot of times by developmental trauma. And also we see less activation of the amygdala. And so if you go back to, you know, the head principle of what wires together, fires together, if you look at, again, that complex trauma and what it does to neurobiology is, and research now shows actually smaller in size, prefrontal cortex, larger in size amygdala, practicing mindfulness has that inverse, and if I could make a jump, if Curt would let me, almost a healing sort of effect on that traumatized brain, which is incredibly exciting, especially for somebody who I think from a talk therapy perspective, didn't always feel like I was helping heal that brain in ways that were incredibly effective before this information came out too. And Jerry, I'd like, I know you've studied the brain once for a couple hours in your development here, and just anything you might want to add to my very general thinking about mindfulness and neurobiology.
Well, you know, what comes to mind is some of the work of Ruth Lanius up in Toronto, kind of looking at the midbrain structures, the default mode network that gets activated when we're not involved in a task. Mm-hmm. You know, when we're not thinking about a task, our different brain structures get activated that allow us to start to think about ourselves, to think about, right? And for trauma, people with histories of trauma and adversity, when they stop being involved in things in the world and they go inside and that natural process comes up, it gets very activating. It gets very frightening. It's scary. So the very act of stopping and disengaging and going inside, as you talked about, it tends to activate old memories and activate the part of our brain that actually is very important and, you know, is related to our sense of self. When we have this ability to kind of be calm and be within ourselves. I mean, you know, we're, you know, as we don't know, but we may be one of the only creatures that has this ability to have internal representations of the world as we're kind of going on. And so to be able to visit that neighborhood and be able to be calm and be able to kind of be with ourselves is really a gift that gets kind of taken away from people who have especially childhood adversity and where it wasn't safe enough to kind of go inside. So I think not only does mindfulness kind of build connectivity between those networks, but it creates a sense of competence in kind of being with ourselves. And what, you know, we know is as we're calmer with ourselves and more attuned to our own internal world, that actually makes us more attuned to other people's intentions and attentions. So I think mindfulness has the impact of increasing our sense of self and our sense of competence and capabilities, which increase our connectedness with others. So if you think about a trajectory, is that as we create more of these positive experiences, it activates different neural networks that allow us to have different behavioral experiences out in the world that then reinforce the learning. So I think, you know, as Melissa talked about, is if you can have an experience of being able to be taking a test and not having that overwhelming anxiety. That in itself becomes a building block for the increasing the ability to work on those kind of skills and to be able to be successful in life. So I think it's both a biological, but there's also a interpersonal process to mindfulness that allows people to be in relationships different.
Awesome. Awesome.
I think one of the kind of the integrative concepts here that I hope that any of my behavioral colleagues who are listening will remember this, and for those of you who are interacting with my behavioral colleagues, I hope you can remember it too while you're talking to each other, is that really experiences change behavior, and they also can change the structure and function of the brain and of biology in much the same way that there's this interactional nature between the two. And
Say that again to your behaviors, friends.
Are you really friends or just reinforcers?
my friend,
You just changed them with your experience.
my single friend who's my only friend in the world who's listening. Go eat some birthday cake, Jerry.
I would agree to kind of piggyback on what both you guys are saying about the relationships. It is really important. I mean, if a parent is practicing mindfulness while their kid is also learning it, there's gonna be a much better relationship with that parent and that child. Between siblings, between teachers and students. I was just doing a workshop recently, and there was a woman in there who was talking about that she was participating in a family mindfulness program, but she was the only one practicing. And even though she was the only one practicing, there was still a systemic change that they noticed within their family. That piece, it was amazing to hear that from somebody when there are so many people that question, or finger point and say they need to do it. In classrooms, like the kids need to do it, or vice versa, the teachers need to do it, or the parent needs to do it, or coming to us and say, fix my kid. It doesn't work that way. We all need to be kind of looking at our role, as a therapist. If I'm not practicing mindfulness, I'm not able to really integrate it and help a child integrate it into their life. If I'm helping a parent and I'm not practicing, there's that same, in a relational end there as well. So I think that's definitely an important part to look at, that if you are practicing and or you are more mindful, the changes that happen in your interactions allow you to go a little bit on not having to try as hard and more on that autopilot end, over time.
Absolutely. And this is why I believe mindfulness is such an important component of our own self-care. If you look at what I think about this from a manager leadership perspective, because I know I need to do it, and I'm sure Jerry, all three of you know me well enough to know that's true. You've seen me present. I need this desperately, but the research I've seen is, and I think about what would help the people I've supervised over my career be successful in their work, whether that's in education, psychology, social work, whatever it is. And we see there's been some interesting studies done on people in those positions, and increase of compassion, increase of the ability to attune or build really healthy relationships and maintain those with folks, social intelligence, emotional intelligence. I like to throw the immune functioning. We get less colds, those sort of things as well. And I think Melissa, you bring up such a good point, is if we're going to help integrate this into our work, we got to practice our own. And that's a conclusion that I've come to as well. And I used to be really gentle with people about this. It's like, oh, just give me 7 minutes out of your day. Just please give me 7 minutes out of your day. And now it's like, I don't know how you can do this work if you don't practice mindfulness. And I'm getting cranky in my own age maybe, but again, if you look at the research, I don't see it. And it's such an important part of our work with people to help them establish their own practice too. So Absolutely.
I think it can be intimidating because when people
Yeah.
hear I need to practice mindfulness and they're living, you know, a really busy life, I don't have time for that. I don't have time to put that in my schedule. And I think that's an important piece to look at is we don't need to just be thinking about formal mindfulness practices. We don't need to just be thinking about, you know, sitting in a quiet corner that's like a meditation center of our house that is, you know, we have to be there for 30 minutes a day. We don't have to look at formal only. You know, and formal doesn't have to just be that. It could be listening to a guided meditation. I love the Muse headband. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that. It gives you the feedback.
You do like that? That's been on my wish list on Amazon for a while, but you like that?
I do like it. It's hard. I mean, it's hard. It's not as gentle as other meditations, but you can do as little as 3 minutes. I mean, you don't have to do, you know, 30 minutes a day. But the other thing that I also like to talk to people about, whether it's clients, teachers, therapists, you know, whoever, with the regards of self-care is we can always do a minute or 30 seconds of a mindful activity. There's always time. It could be for a kid, it could be getting a pencil out of their backpack that they are in that moment pausing and feeling what as they're grabbing the pen, or unzipping the zipper of their pencil case, or, you know, you pull up to your house and when you're walking up to your front door, what do you notice differently in that moment that you maybe haven't noticed before? So it forces you to kind of stop and look at all of what's around you instead of just being stuck up here. Mm-hmm. You know, you are up here because you're looking, you're smelling, you're seeing, you know, you are engaging all of your senses. But did you notice that there's a flower now blooming on the tree next door? You know, did you notice that you know, I don't know, that a tree's now gone somewhere? Like there's, you know, those are little really informal, and I know I'm kind of using some random examples, but those are informal practices that don't need to be as scary to somebody. That, you know, I still am very supportive of, do need to have, especially in the helping professions, we do need to have a formal practice, whether it's, you know, going on a run, going on a hike, you know, walking, listening to music. I mean, you can do different things that you can just make the mental note that this is my mindful self-care activity. Mm-hmm. And by doing that, you're giving your body and your mind that time to get into a different space.
Excellent.
You bring up a really good point, Melissa, that you can do it while you're engaged in activities, right? That you don't have to stop. And I think one of the things I've heard the most about it being an unpleasant experience is that ticker tape going on, you know, of thoughts that's going through your brain. The first part of it is all the things I need to do next. Yep. And to sit and not respond to all the things I need to do next is really unpleasant. That's really uncomfortable. And for me, that's been my experience with people with mindfulness. They're like, I don't want to do that. That's not fun for me. So I don't want to sit and think about all the things that I'm not doing right now while I'm sitting and doing mindfulness. Yeah. So I think your point is a really, really important one about doing it even while you're engaged in things, that you can be mindful during those things as well.
You know,
go ahead, Jerry.
I was thinking about a mother or a dad sitting with their infant and really being present and in a non-judgmental way and creating a space for that child is really mindfulness, right? Mm-hmm. And what we know is when we pay attention in an intentional way, whether it's internally to our experience or to another human being, it optimizes our self-organizing capacities. So the brain uses the activation of itself to organize itself. It's self-organizing. And that capacity is maximized when somebody pays attention to you in a non-judgmental way to kind of look at that. And really what we're doing really is being really good caretakers to ourselves. We're paying attention non-judgmentally to our own process as if we would do to an infant to create a secure, safe environment for that child to grow. So I think we've kind of labeled that as mindfulness, but really it's really holding ourselves in this secure place, in a safe, secure place that allows us to maximize our growth potential. And I think that if you can't hold yourself in that way, it's really hard to hold somebody else, right? that we know. And so your thought about therapy or caretaking or being a teacher it's really important for us to be able to, in some ways, create the space to see the other person, to hear the other person, to know the other person. And in order to do that, we need to be mindful.
Yeah.
Kind of go back to that.
Absolutely. And Melissa, I want to wrap up with you maybe giving us some practical suggestions, especially maybe for some of our listeners who aren't doing any of this in their own personal life and professionally. I do want to comment really briefly because Curt, I love, I hear that as well too, is, oh, I sit here and my mind just wanders and I just can't do it. And I did see this nugget of research come out lately, is that is actually a really positive thing, because we maximize the benefits of mindfulness early on when we just start practice. When our mind wanders, to bring it back, that's the maximum neurobiological benefit that we can get. So I even tell people now is, okay, let me take that excuse. Being bad at mindfulness, which isn't really a thing, actually means you're good at mindfulness and you're getting even more benefits. So
Nice reframe, Matt.
yeah, I've learned to knock all the excuses down. Like, you gotta give me 7 minutes at least. Yeah, I'm very unmindful in my advocacy for mindfulness.
That's the mindfulness application of, or mindless application.
That's how much violent.
Just practice. It's awesome. Look at me. I'm so regulated.
I promise to not be judging you, but you must do it.
Let's do it. Yes. All right, Melissa, we got a few minutes left, and but I want you to be able to take some time with this too. Is for folks that are maybe new to this, that may not have be practicing in their classrooms or with their clients and whatever situations they're in. I know this is a very general question, but what are some maybe simple activities to kind of get people starting and experience this either in their own life or their own work, or maybe both?
I would say be gentle with yourself and start small. If you're intimidated by it, you're nervous about it, you're anxious about it, you're anxious about your to-do list and all that needs to be done, start really small. And start with just breathing. We breathe often not really paying much attention to our breath. And one of an easy-ish thing to do is if you put your hands on your belly button and you allow your hands to go in and out as you're breathing in through your nose and out through your mouth, and just allow that process and count. If you count, while you're doing that, you're in that moment, whether it's you count to 30, you count to 10, you count to 100, you're doing a mindful activity. The 4-7-8 breath is one of my favorites, where you breathe in through your nose for 4 counts, you hold for 7 counts, and then you exhale through your mouth for 8 counts. That's one of my always go-tos, and anybody who's listening, you can go online and you can watch videos on YouTube on how to do that. And there's a lot of good research out there on the benefits of doing that 4-7-8 breath. With little kids, you have them lay down and put a stuffed animal on their stomach and have them breathe and watch their teddy bear or their stuffed animal go raise and fall. I also just like, there's an app called Stop, Breathe, and Think. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that one, that a lot of my teenagers like to use. And I've had, clients that will search and they'll find their own favorite, meditation on a YouTube channel, or what I do like about the app is it has you check in with how you're emotionally feeling and have you check in with how you are feeling physically. So then based on those, it gives you a list of recommended meditations and guided meditations that it will play for you. So that's something I like. There's a way of tracking it to see. You get little awards if you've done a bunch of them. So there's for little kids, that can be a really good one. But again, going back to the simplicity of being gentle with yourself and just trying small things, putting a Post-it on your bathroom counter that when you're brushing your teeth, I know I keep using that example after your last podcast, but use that as an example of, in that moment, taste the toothpaste, feel the sensations while you're brushing your teeth. That's bringing you connected to the practice, the behavior of where your body is and what your body is doing, and preventing your mind from role playing, like going through your list of appointments for the day or your list of tasks for the day. So I think the difference between informal and formal practice is something that I would love for people to take away, that it doesn't need to always be this formal, meditative practice. There's a lot of research out there that you go on a run, if you aren't mindful while you're running, you're going to fall. So there's a mindful activity. Yes, people sometimes will still play the day over, but you have to be connected to where you're running. So you are connected in some way to making sure you're not going to trip over something. So you can start in those sorts of ways. The ultimate goal is that we are integrating more of our day-to-day activities to be more mindful. Having a meal and actually tasting your food, not just eating it. Having your cup of coffee in the morning or your tea in the morning, but actually tasting and enjoying it, not just having that be a habitual activity that you do. So there's always more, but there's a little quick summary.
Get you started for sure. So, Melissa, I really appreciate your time today. I hope you enjoyed it enough. Maybe when that book comes out, we can have you back and you can share some more of the concrete strategies. Because I'm really excited for you. And like I said, being exposed to your work has just really been an influence on me around this topic as well. And so I want to thank you for joining us. Jerry, again, my friend, happy birthday. I can sing once we get off the air here. So I won't torture our audience with it because our viewership will crash.
You got an eye roll, Matt. You got a full-on eye roll.
This is not the type of attention that's mindful, Matt.
He's misattuned right now.
Right.
Way to apply the material that we learned today, Jerry. Well done. So friends, as always, you can find some show notes, different resources and stuff at traumainformedlens.org. Also, you can see our pretty faces on video there as well. So I want to thank again, Melissa, Jerry, Curt, great episode. And
Thank you, Melissa.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much, Melissa.
Thank you.
We'll be back next week with another episode. Thank you guys so much. And Melissa as well.